First, I'd like to thank the American Foundation and Charles Gould and Gregary J for inviting me tonight and giving me the opportunity to speak to an audience of translators, publishers, and other people obviously interested in translation. Last summer in France, just before I came to New York, I met with many people to talk about the ways of promoting translation, French fiction and non-fiction in the US. And everyone told me, it's gonna be difficult for you. You are going to be like a missionary preaching in a desert of translation. And then I was, of course, a bit worried. And when I settled in New York, I realized that there were many reasons, actually, to think twice about this French pessimism and about the 3% tune, the idea of like only 3% of the books published in the US are translation. First, because the situation is finally not as bad as it may seem at first sight, and second, because I think there's a big potential that hasn't been totally exploited yet. First, the current situation. French continues to be the most widely translated language in the US, both for fiction and non-fiction, and about one new fiction book in 10 published in the Rentrée littéraire is actually translated into English. And it's not only a matter of quantity, but also of quality. And if you look at the 100 notable books of 2012 for the New York Times, you realize that there are only 4 books in translation, which is not that great, of course, but 2 of them are French, Laurent Binet and Marianne Diaye, which is 50%, I would say, but no, it's just I didn't want to make this list sound as a cocorico or as a new example of the French modesty, but neither as a wishful thinking, but more like a good reason to keep fighting for translation, because the situation is not as bad, and I think, translation, I think, and I'm not the only one to think that, is having very important moments in the US. It's not only through David Bellos' book, which has been very honored tonight, I think, which was one of the New York Times notable book for 2011, and the recent anthology published by Susan and Esther, which have already gained some attention. And when I meet publishers, I realize that there are a lot of new collections for translated books created here and there. There are also very good master's programs that focus on literary translation, such as the one at Queen's College or at NYU with Emmanuel Artel. So there is, I think, a big potential to exploit, and I want to talk not only about why translation matters. I think we all agree on that point, I hope so at least. But about how we can have more translations and how translation can matter more than it actually does. And I think and I hope that the book department of the French Embassy can play an even more important role than it already plays. We're a team of 5 in New York. Myself, 2 officers in charge of fiction and non-fiction, 1 French intern and 1 American intern. And we're in charge of coordinating not only what's happening in New York, but also in the rest of the US through 9 other cultural attachés in the big cities. And first, what we do is that we help translate to supplement the job already, the great job done by the French Publishers Agency and Lucinda Cartel, and by the right directors in France. First, we give grants. We fund about 30 titles a year through the French Voices Awards, the Hemingway Grants, the Acquisitions of Rights program. And French Voices, for instance, was created in 2006. And these last 7 years, we supported 71 titles, among which the bestseller The Elegance of the Hedgehog, published by Muriel Barbery, which quickly sold about 1 million copies, which is not that bad. And among the laureates, one important point is that 20 titles had no publishers, and they found one after receiving the grant. And starting from this year, we made an important change. $2,000 out of the $6,000 awarded for the prize will be given directly to the translator, in recognition for his or her work, because we really value the work done by translators. We also fund one translation residency. We also send 1 or 2 American publishers every year to France for them to meet with French publishers and discover new books to translate. And to promote French novels which are hot off the press, we publish twice a year an online magazine called Fiction France with 20 translated excerpts. And it helped us over the years to develop our network of translators and to know what translators need. And we are also exploring a new track for which we really need your help, actually. Some journals have asked me, when I met them, for some French original text to publish. And along with the French Publishers Agency, who does that as well, we are gathering some short texts in fiction and non-fiction to try to have them published in journals or online blogs. So if you have some good French short story, if you have translated some of them, already talked about that with Emmanuel, please send them to us and we'll try our best to. We have a bit of funding for translation of excerpts as well, so please tell us. And we were also asked, as I see another call, for reviews of as yet untranslated French books. Some journals are interested in that as well. So if you know students, or if some students among you would like to write some reviews, please tell us. Second part of our job, I'll try to be quick, we promote translations when they are published. So we focus on giving more visibility to the translation and to help them to get a better distribution. So first, we decided to rethink our traditional authors on tour program. So we are now building some thematic series to make trends in the French literary landscape more readable, more visible to the press. So, and we systematically now match French writers with American writers who will attract the audience. So in this year, for instance, we focused on illustrated books with a festival called Picture This, and we focused as well on the Proust centenary, and there are going to be some French contemporary writers in the fall, inspired by Proust. And next year we will do a series on poetry, another one involving French and American fiction and non-fiction journals, and another one on the faux amis in philosophy. It's a good program, I think. Second, we are investing in the American Libraries Association conference in Las Vegas next June. We're thinking of organizing panels and bringing brochures on fiction, non-fiction, and comics and kids' books to help librarians make their choice and obviously orient them toward translated books. And last but not least, we have a new website, frenchculture.org, and of course everybody here is welcome to have a look at it. And we write articles, more general articles, to give landmarks to the public, to help them to understand what's going on in France. And we have also started on Twitter. We started 2 months ago, and we now have about 200 followers. And we are extremely proud of having 200 followers, but I think we can do better. So please don't hesitate to, if you are on Twitter, to subscribe. And last but not least, it was the second last but not least, we built a list of all the titles which have been translated into English for 2012 and also for 2013 in fiction and non-fiction. So we really want to have the most exhaustive list so that we can give it the most visibility possible, and so we need your help as well. So all these tools are really for you, for translators, publishers, and lovers of French translations. And most of these tools, they come from you, from the numerous discussions and meetings we had with publishers and with translators. And as Antonin said, the translators and publishers are, of course, our best ambassadors. And you have the best sense of what you need. So this is an ongoing process, and everybody here is very welcome to tell us what you think would be useful. Thank you very much.
Let's see, I'm last, and I guess it falls to me to sort of make it up as I go along, sort of like a translator. I suppose all of us agree here that translation matters, and I think probably most of us agree that translation is a virtuous activity, even if we'd like to be smugglers. I could give a recent example, since I'm an editor and publisher, of the ways in which translation can surprise, which is that we published a book by a man named John Williams, called Stoner, that has done very well for us over the years. It's the best-selling book in the series, but it doesn't sell scads and scads of copies by normal bestseller standards in America. And it's an odd, quiet book that sold nothing at all when it was first published in the 1960s. The author is long since dead. It sold about 2,000 copies and was forgotten and put out of print rather rapidly. About a guy who comes from a backcountry Missouri poor circumstance, and goes to the university to study agronomy and runs into, encounters medieval literature and is seduced, and everything goes downhill from there. But it's a moving book in its own way, about somebody being devoted to literature and about somebody being translated from one circumstance to another, and the wrenching things that can happen with that. And quite a powerful book. So anyway, we published it some years ago, and it's done nicely. And then a French writer, Anna Cavalda, liked the book and translated in France, where it became an actual bestseller. It has since gone on to be a bestseller in Israel, and it is currently #2 in the Netherlands after Dan Brown, having been #1 for a month before that. It does very well in Italy, it does very well in Spain. In some sense, in this case, a French writer's actually taking over the book and translating it into French from English, has had these entirely unanticipated, international consequences, or at least pan-European, and in fact is now washing back here, and that people are covering the book and saying, what's happening that this strange, forgotten American book could actually be popular in France, Israel, Spain, the Netherlands, or as the one who spoke the other day, what was that, the Netherlands or Denmark? Being a little uncertain in America about what place is what. It's funny in a larger sense that the question of whether translation matters should arise, because in a way I think to the extent that in a way we're all formed more by reading literature than, say, way back when, scripture, or something like that, or philosophy, or essays, or what you will. All of our culture is a translated culture. I mean, that's just sort of a given. People, in every language read Madame Bovary. People read in every language read War and Peace, and in some sense the canonical works, they are the canonical works, are always translated. Not only going back to the Greeks, but throughout. It's an absolute given. So, I mean, we live entirely in a translated world. And so much so that it becomes a puzzle why literature is always taught in universities in terms of linguistic departments, because in fact literature is almost entirely experienced across languages, and almost any writer of literature is not sitting down to say, well, I'm sitting down to write the great American novel, but maybe only in America and Russia do people sit down to write the great novel of their one language. I think in other places they just say, I'm going to write a great novel, and the expectation, desire is that novel will be translated into every other language. I mean, that's what a successful novelist wants to have happen. I don't think the novelist, and ditto, by the way, for the poet, wants to sit down and say, wait, I wrote it in immaculate Russian, which can never, ever, ever be translated. And only, and in that sense, translation is the measure of meaning or translatability. And I think Hegel said somewhere that if it can't be translated, finally it doesn't matter. More practically speaking, to wrap up, an odd thing, of course, something that has been a persistent concern for all of us here, has been America's, or really the Anglo-Saxon world's resistance in the last century to translation. And I think it's important to qualify this, because one thing that struck me a few years ago was that, 100 years ago, a little more than 100 years ago, there were not just one but two complete translations of Balzac available in English. 100 years ago, you can pick up a book from 100 years ago of the Scandinavian Library and Niels Linab and various other important books of Pontoppidan and so on. I'm undoubtedly mangling their names. Were available in English. A complete Maupassant was available in English at that time. America was very much America, not to speak for England in different circumstances, but was, I think, very much aware of itself as an aspiring but provincial country that needed to get news from the rest of the world. I think that continued, or actually was reawakened after the war, when America became a power, or a central power. And under the GI Bill, a huge amount of translation goes on, and certainly growing up at the very, very tail end of publishing programs that started then for universities and so on, was intensely aware of international literature. I was much more interested in international literature than American literature, which I had no interest in. But that we've gone through, after 1989, we've gone through however many years it's been, where, having sort of won that particular fight, we closed off for a while. And I think, we were the province that had conquered the world. I think that's changing. I think there's a way in which, I think this is a good moment for translation, where small presses particularly, great presses like New Directions, Archipelago in the States, are able to, Open Letter, I should mention, many university presses have such programs. Many of them are supported generously by, and have to be supported still by, the cultural embassies of other countries, like the French, are finding an audience of younger readers who are restless in what had seemed a provincialized America, restless too after really very demanding educations often, and want to find out about other ways of writing things, other ways of thinking about things, other worlds which are not, which can only come through literature and translation. Thanks.
Join you up here if I may. Laurence, those of us at the French American Foundation would love to work with you and expand your Twitter followers. We have a mapping project underway. The goal is to make sure that every college and university French department in the country knows about the French American Foundation. And that is a goal. We will get it done this year because we're doing a lot of good things. So whether it's through the Foundation Forum that comes out every week, we can link what you're doing at the embassy and at the consulate. And certainly we will try to digest the richness of this discussion tonight and get it out to our list. I think it's over 4,000 people. So we'd love to work with you and expand what you're doing and get French American issues out to every campus. David Bellows, where are you? Would you like to comment?
I'm here to listen to you. That was all very, very interesting. And I think the only thing I would want to add is that American and British publishing live on translation. And it mustn't be forgotten that foreign rights sales, translation, French have a word for it, extraduction. Translation the other way is a vital part of the financing of the American book system. And you really must think this has to be, well, if not symmetrical, at least in some kind of better balance than it is at present. If we sort of take that message back, that actually translation does really matter to the American book system. Financially, it couldn't exist without selling all those foreign rights. And most decent books published here are translated into 17 or 37 or 52 languages. There has to be more of a counterparty, especially with those major languages like French, that are an essential interlanguage through French that most US publishers learn about writing in dozens of other languages, because nobody here reads all the languages that are translated into French, which are more numerous than the translated. That's the only thing I would add. Just thank you all for, well, not thank you, keep it, don't mention me quite so.
David, just a question. Does the rise of e-publishing have an impact on this world, and also for our guests here? How does that affect the business model of the publishing world?
Well, that I don't know.
It seemed to me it would actually open it up and be an opportunity to expand the reach of
Yes, I think undoubtedly in the long run. I think it's as probably everybody's heard, anybody who claims to know what's going to happen with e-publishing really doesn't know what he's talking about, so I'm not going to claim any particular expertise. But, I mean, I've been interested in going to the book fairs in Europe, that there's an openness certainly from European agents to electronic publishing in this country. And certainly we, for example, have an endeavor to publish books only electronically to begin with and sort of see how they do. And I guess the kind of waffle there is the sign of the difficulty or the ambiguity of the situation, is that one's still waffling, I mean, is an e-publishing still not a real publication, but a kind of trial run? I mean, I think we're still waiting for the structures by which people feel that a thing becomes real, which is, is that it's been published, somehow presented before the world. I think e-books are not quite, I think only e-books are not quite there, and I suspect they will be there. I don't see any reason why they shouldn't be. There are all the advantages for publishers of warehousing, and not to mention not having huge libraries to move around and so on, but I don't think we're quite there yet.
Gary, do you want to comment on things that have been said by your colleagues here, and then we'll open it up in general for the audience?
Just one quick comment, I think, about the notion of a bridge language that we were talking about, that David just mentioned it again. It goes both ways. The German Romantics thought that if everything could be translated into German, German would become the repository of Weltliteratur, and everyone would have to learn German. But they also looked at it as a way to enrich their own culture. That if they could translate through a kind of a foreignizing method, these kind of new aesthetics and new forms could come into German, and that would actually help German. And now I keep hearing, David made me think when he said, French is in many ways a bridge language, well, so is English, and I think English may be the ultimate bridge language. I'm not sure, I don't want to get into that contest, but we know how important it is, for example, for anyone who wins the Nobel Prize to have been translated into English. I wonder how many people on the Nobel Committee read Chinese, for example. They must have read Mo Yan in something. It's either English or French, I hazard. And I think David has done work himself, I think, with Albanian authors, right, with the help or intermediary or something of a French translation. I think that's what we mean. But then there seems to be a kind of a tension, if not a contradiction. Why, if English has this kind of importance in the world of translation as a bridge language, do we only publish 3% of our books in translation?
Let's open it up to our guests for comments, questions. Do not be shy. I'm going to go, yes, go ahead. And please tell us who you are.
I'm a Parker, not a translator, not a publisher, but I speak French, I read in French, and I read the translations also. The 3% figure, is it titles as opposed to, if 1 million books are published of the same title, does that count as one book or does that count as 1 million? When you say 3%, is it titles?
Of all books published in a given year.
In the United States, only 3%.
It also includes technical books.
Any kind of book.
Any kind of book and so on. Only 3% of those books.
Just to give you an example, in Brazil, that number is 60%.
Turkey, in France,
It's between 16 and 17%.
Yeah.
And more than one book out of three, is in fiction is a translation. in France. And in the US, it's 1% of fiction.
I wonder, Laurence, if I could just sort of ask a question that's kind of intrigued me. Over the years, I've been fascinated by the Pléiades series in France, which is a wonderful series, rather pricey, but a lot of it, it's not just the great works of French literature, but it's American, Chinese, Japanese, German, Russian. I assume it's commercially successful. And I do know that it has inspired the Library of America here in this country, which does not do translations. No, that's not true.
They did Tocqueville.
Tocqueville, exactly.
Yeah.
And then maybe, is there another one?
There may be another one, but anyway,
Yeah, and then the series that you're doing at the NYRB gives me a lot of optimism that these great series, which I find very appealing and extremely well done, both substantively in terms of how they're presented, cut against some of the gloom and doom about the changing business model of the publishing world. So what's the French experience been like with the Pléiades? Do you have a feel for that? Has it been the Pléiades, but and the role of the translator in that series? Do you have a view on that?
I think that's what I mean too.
A lot of the Pléiades are translations
Yes.
from other languages into
I
French.
don't know what proportion, but it's true that it's a
Yeah,
lot
and
of
just how successful, I assume it's been successful as a series because it's been around for quite a while.
I think people just don't think of it, of these books, these translated books as translation. They just think of them as, universal masterpieces, and we don't. Like, I think it's the translations are as commercial as much as the French masterpieces.
Well, I can't think of any other series in the world that I'm aware of which has the diversity and richness of the Pléiades series. And I know from talking with the woman who now runs the Library of America that the Pléiades series inspired the Library of America, which is a fantastic publishing venture here. So, any thoughts?
well, it's always, I mean, for me, a very basic pleasure and inspiration as an editor is to go to France, where, in fact, most good bookstores shelve books by area from which the origin of the book. I mean, you have French literature, you have Latin American literature, you have African literature, and to go through La Une or something like that is to just have a host of suggestions of books that most of which are out of print or never were in print in English. I think going back very early to the beginning of the series, I mean, a point, I was in Paris and I walked into a small bookstore, and there on the table was The Anatomy of Melancholy, which is a 1,300-page piece of Jacobean, dense, intricate English Jacobean prose, which had just been translated into French and was fully available. We'd been sitting around scratching our heads saying, dare we republish The Anatomy of Melancholy in English, which had been out of print for a good 25 or 30 years. And I'm thinking, listen, if the French can translate it, we can just republish it in English, can't we? I mean, that's, and we did, and in fact the book did very well. I mean, of course, the French translation along those lines, well, it's a tremendous tribute to the culture, French literary culture that there is interest in, and indeed there can be, as there was, government funding for a translation of 1,300 pages of Baroque English prose.
I bought it, by the way.
Did you? Yeah. And this is a different country. But nonetheless, the English edition did all right. But I don't know that I could do a translation of, I don't know, the French equivalent. We'll have to think what that might be.
May I make a suggestion?
Yeah.
Victor Hugo, L'Homme qui rit. It's a wonderful novel, and it's extraordinary. It's by Victor Hugo. It's set in England. It's about England, and it's never been translated in English.
All right. You'll do it, right?
How do you make your decisions about what is translated? Because I know now the NYRB has a subscription series, right? With different prices. You can get 6 books a year or 12 books a year, something like that.
Yeah, and I mean, you want to know how we make the decisions about what you can get as a subscriber? You want to know how we make the decision about what we publish?
Both.
All right. Well, the second is entirely a question of what we've managed to get actually into print by the time that you get that we have to send the book out. which is very variable.
What's the lead time?
But,
You're going to do a book in translation, like from the Holy Book or the New Book. What's the...
Well, I mean, ideally, you want a book to come in a year before and everything to be done in a timely way, but that's not exactly the way things happen anyway. But that would be the ideal way, and then you would want it to go to print before that. I mean, otherwise, in terms of how, for the series in general, well, I like to answer that by saying rigorously by whim. But it's also true that we have various languages that we have a lot of Italian authors, we have a lot of Hungarian authors, we have a lot of Russian authors, so I like to add to those traditions that we already represent, and then I like periodically to be persuaded to add something that we have never done before, and then perhaps start a new voice.
Any other questions before we move to the awards part of the ceremony? Yes?
I think it's fairly rare that a small press publisher can have something that is really good, say, in English, that anyone would be interested in France. Usually what comes out in France will be better sometimes. Yes, I guess so.
Yeah, that's true. It's true that, for instance, in France, among the bestsellers, most of them are translated from the English, so it's much more commercial literature that gets translated into French. And on the other way, it's more literary works, some more experimental and more literary, and then by smaller presses, and with not as many copies and not really bestsellers. But they sell in the long run as well. I mean, they become quite, not classics of course, but I mean, they can sell on 10 years, 20 years, and 100 copies a year. So in the end, they get to 3,000 copies, which is...
Please join me in thanking our guests this evening. Fantastic. I'd now like to